Marcus Webb had never imagined his life would lead him to the edge of known space, fixing broken machinery for aliens who barely tolerated his presence. Yet here he was, 6 years after leaving Earth's engineering cores, covered in hydraulic fluid and something that smelled vaguely like cinnamon, but probably WASN, single quotes T. threshold. Station wasn't much to look at a hodgepodge mining colony where desperate humans mixed with a dozen alien species, all trying to scratch out a living from the asteroids that tumbled through this sector. Marcus's repair shop occupied a converted cargo bay near the station's commercial ring, its walls still bearing the stenciled warnings about decompression protocols that nobody bothered to read anymore. He wiped his hands on a rag that had once been white, surveying the cluttered workspace with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. 3 repair jobs sat half-finished on his bench: a Droven atmospheric scrubber, a human-made plasma cutter with a cracked housing, and what appeared to be a Vulcan navigation array, though he was still figuring out which end was up. The soft scrape of claws on metal made him turn toward the entrance. She was there again. The Vulcan child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 in human years, though Marcus had learned that aging worked differently for her species. Her fur was the color of burnished copper, with darker stripes along her arms and the distinctive tufted ears that marked her people. She wore a simple tunic of woven fabric that shimmered with embedded tech threads, typical of Vulcan clothing. "Hey there, little wanderer," Marcus said, keeping his voice gentle. "Come to watch me work again?" The child stepped inside, her movements careful and measured. Marcus had noticed this about her over the past 2 months of her visits. She moved like someone navigating an unfamiliar room in the dark. Testing each step before committing her weight dot, she settled onto the crate he'd designated as her spot, tucking her tail around her legs. Her large, amber eyes seemed to track his movements, but there was something off about the way she held her head, always tilted slightly, as if listening rather than looking. "Got something interesting today," Marcus continued, returning to his workbench. He'd learned she didn't talk much, but she seemed to enjoy his company. "This is a Vulcan nav array. Your people make the most elegant tech I've ever seen. Everything integrated, nothing wasted. See how these filaments connect." He held up the device, watching her reaction. Her ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, and her whiskers twitched. But her eyes didn't quite focus on the object in his hands. That's when it clicked. Marcus sat down the nav array carefully, his engineer's mind already racing through observations he'd cataloged without conscious thought. The way she never reached for things unless he placed them directly in her hands. How she oriented herself by sound, her ears constantly moving to track the sources of noise in his shop. The careful testing steps. "Can you see this?" he asked softly, holding the device closer to her. The child's ears flattened slightly. A Vulcan expression he'd learned indicated distress. She shook her head, the movement small and hesitant. "How long?" Marcus asked, crouching down to her level. She held up 3 fingers on one delicate hand, her claws retracted. 3 months. The same amount of time she'd been visiting his shop. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. "What happened?" The child's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, with the purring undertones characteristic of her species. "Reactor leak. Station maintenance. I was playing where I shouldn't have been. The radiation damaged your optic nerves," Marcus concluded, his mind already spinning through possibilities. "Why didn't you tell me?" She ducked her head. "You're the only one who talks to me like I'm still here. Everyone else uses sad voices." Marcus understood that feeling more than she knew. After his discharge from the Corps, not dishonorable, but not exactly glowing either, he dealt with enough pitying looks to last a lifetime. People saw the limp he'd developed after the accident on Europa Station, saw the way his hands trembled sometimes when the phantom pains hit, and they decided he was broken. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "You are still here. This doesn't change that." Her ears perked up slightly, hope flickering across her feline features. Marcus stood, his mind already cataloging the components scattered across his shop. Vulcan neural architecture was different from human, but the principles might translate. He'd worked with enough sensory augmentation tech in the cores, had even helped develop some of the prototype systems before the accident that ended his military career. "What's your name?" he asked, realizing he'd never learned it. "Nisra," she said quietly. "Well, Nisra, how would you feel about being my assistant on a special project?" Her tail began to swish with cautious excitement. "What kind of project?" "The kind where I try to give you a different way of seeing the world." Marcus pulled out his battered tablet, already sketching preliminary designs. "It won't be like your eyes were. It'll be something new. But it might let you navigate on your own again." "Really?" The hope in her voice made his chest tighten. "Really. But I need your help. You'll have to tell me what works and what doesn't, okay?" Nisra nodded eagerly, sliding off her crate to stand beside him. For the first time since she'd started visiting, she looked truly animated. Her whiskers forward and her tail held high. Marcus spent the rest of that afternoon explaining his ideas while Nisra listened with rapt attention. He talked about how echolocation worked for some Earth creatures, how electromagnetic fields could be mapped and translated into spatial data, how pressure changes in the air might be converted into a form her brain could interpret as proximity information. "Your people's tech already uses neural interfaces," Marcus mused, studying the Vulcan nav array. "If I can adapt the sensory input protocols, create a device that feeds environmental data directly to your visual cortex, ... Will it hurt?" Nisra asked. "Not if I do it right. And I always do it right." Marcus gave her a reassuring smile. Eventually. Over the next week, Marcus transformed his already chaotic shop into a complete disaster zone. He called in favors from every contact he had on Threshold Station. A Drovan technician who owed him for fixing his ship's life. Support sold him a neural mapping sensor at cost. A human smuggler with a soft spot for lost causes provided some military-grade processing chips that were definitely not legal for civilian use. A Vulcan merchant, intrigued by his project, donated several broken neural interface bands from damaged equipment. Nisra came every day, patiently letting him run tests, answering questions about how her species processed information, describing what she remembered about sight before the accident. "Colors were like songs," she told him one evening as he soldered delicate connections. "Each one had a different feeling. Then we'll make sure the device gives you something similar," Marcus promised. "Maybe not exactly songs, but patterns you can learn to recognize." The prototype took shape slowly. It looked nothing like traditional eyewear instead. It was a curved band that would wrap around the upper portion of her head, with subtle sensors that would rest against her temples and forehead. The design incorporated Vulcan aesthetic sensibilities. He'd learned enough about her culture to know that appearance mattered, and he wanted her to be proud to wear it. On the 13th day, as Threshold Station's artificial evening cycle dimmed the commercial ring's lighting, Marcus made the final calibration. "Ready?" he asked Nisra, who sat very still on her crate. "Ready," she whispered. Marcus placed the device carefully on her head, adjusting it to fit her smaller skull structure. The sensors aligned with her neural pathways, and he powered it on with a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Nisra gasped, her hands flying up to touch the device. "Marcus?" Her voice shook. "I can ... There's something. It's not like before, but I can tell where you are. You're like a warm space in the air, and your workbench is... It's cooler, all these different shapes. The device is translating thermal signatures sonic reflections, and electromagnetic fields. Marcus explained, his own voice rough with emotion. Your brain will learn to interpret them as spatial information. Nisra stood carefully, then took a step forward. Then another. She navigated around a toolbox on the floor, her movements growing more confident. I can move, she breathed. By myself. I can actually move. She turned toward him, and though the device covered her eyes, Marcus could see the joy radiating from every line of her small body. Then she launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. Thank you, she sobbed into his shirt. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Marcus hugged her back, blinking away the moisture in his own eyes. You're welcome, little wanderer. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shop's entrance, a tall Vulcan male with darker fur and cold, calculating eyes. He observed the scene for several long minutes before disappearing, back into the station's corridors. The message he sent from his personal comm device was brief. Mother needs to see this human. Now. 3 days later, Marcus's world would change forever. Marcus was testing a new calibration on Nisra's device when the soldiers arrived. He'd been expecting Nisra for her usual afternoon visit, had even prepared a small surprise, a modification that would let her see color variations by translating different material densities into subtle vibration patterns against her temples. The kind of detail work that made his hands ache, but was worth it to see her excitement. Instead, his shop's entrance darkened with 4 figures in ceremonial armor. They weren't station security. Marcus recognized Vulcan military dress when he saw it burnished chest plates that caught the light like oil on water, ceremonial blades at their hips that were definitely functional despite their ornate appearance. These weren't local enforcers. These were house guards. The lead soldier stepped forward, her fur a striking silver gray, her amber eyes fixed on Marcus with professional assessment. Marcus Webb? That's me. Marcus set down his tools carefully, very aware that sudden movements around armed soldiers were generally bad ideas. Can I help you? You will accompany us to the House of Meridian. Matriarch Yunara requests your presence. It wasn't phrased as a request. Marcus's stomach dropped. House of Meridian. He'd heard the name whispered in the Vulcan quarters of the Station One of the prominent merchant families. Old money and older traditions. The kind of people who didn't usually acknowledge human existence unless absolutely necessary. Is this about Nisra? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Is she all right? The soldier's expression didn't flicker. The child is well. You have 5 minutes to make yourself presentable. Marcus glanced down at his grease-stained work clothes, then at the soldier's immaculate armor. Right, because showing up to meet. Vulcan nobility looking, like he'd been wrestling machinery all day, would definitely go well. He ducked into the small bathroom at the back of his shop, splashing water on his face and changing into the least offensive shirt he owned, a dark gray button-up that only had a few permanent stains if you knew where to look. His hands shook slightly as he fastened the buttons, and he cursed himself for the weakness. You faced worse than angry alien nobility, he told himself. Remember the reactor breach on Europa? This is nothing. His hands kept shaking. The soldiers formed a square around him as they marched through Threshold Station, drawing stares from every species they passed. Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment and growing anxiety. This wasn't just an escort, this was a statement. Everyone who saw them would know a human was being brought before Vulcan authority. The Vulcan Quarter occupied the most prestigious section of the station, where the architecture shifted from utilitarian metal to something more organic. Living walls of bioluminescent plants cast soft light across polished stone pathways. Water features defied the station's artificial gravity, creating impossible spirals and arches of liquid that sang as they flowed. The House of Meridian's estate dominated the quarters. Central Plaza, a sprawling structure that incorporated both traditional Vulcan design and cutting-edge technology. Curved walls of some material that seemed to shift between solid and translucent. Gardens that bloomed despite the artificial environment. And an entrance flanked by pillars, carved with what Marcus assumed were family histories. They led him through corridors that made his repair shop look like a garbage compactor. Past rooms filled with artifacts and art that probably cost more than he'd earn in a lifetime. Servants paused in their duties to watch him pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. Finally, they reached a formal receiving room. The space was designed to intimidate high ceilings, minimal furniture, and a raised platform at the far end where 3 figures waited. Marcus's breath caught. Nisra stood in the center, wearing formal attire he'd never seen on her before, layered robes of deep blue fabric that shimmered with embedded technology. Her device sat proudly on her head, and she was practically vibrating with excitement when she sensed his presence. Marcus. She started to run toward him, but a hand on her shoulder stopped her. The hand belonged to a young Vulcan male, probably in his early 20s. His fur was the same burnished copper as Nisra's, but darker, with more pronounced striping. He wore formal robes in deep crimson, and his expression as he looked at Marcus was pure suspicion. His tail lashed behind him in a way that Marcus had learned meant agitation or anger. "Restrain yourself, sister," the male said, his voice cold. "This is a formal proceeding." But it was the third figure that made Marcus forget how to breathe. She stood slightly behind and to the left of the young male, tall and graceful even by Vulcan standards. Her fur was a rich amber gold, like honey in sunlight, with subtle darker markings that traced elegant patterns down her arms. She wore robes of deep green that complemented her coloring perfectly, cut in a style that was both modest and somehow devastating. Her face was striking high cheekbones, a delicate muzzle, and large eyes that were a startling shade of green rather than the typical amber. Those eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made his pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. She was, without question, the most beautiful being he'd ever seen. "Marcus Webb," the young male spoke formally, his tone sharp. "I am Tavern of House Meridian, son and heir to this family. You stand before Matriarch Yenara, head of our house and keeper of our honor." The golden-furred female stepped forward, and Marcus realized with a jolt that she was the matriarch. She couldn't be more than 35 in human years, if that translated correctly to Vulcan aging. Too young to be Nisra's grandmother, which meant my mother, Nisra chirped helpfully, earning a sharp look from Tavryn. The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been imagining some stern elderly matron, not ... this. "Marcus Webb." Yenara's voice was like warm honey with an edge of steel beneath. "You have done something remarkable for my daughter." "I just helped a friend," Marcus managed, his mouth suddenly dry. "You violated cultural protocols," Tavern cut in. "You provided medical intervention to a noble child without permission or oversight. You implemented untested technology on a member of House Meridian. Do you understand the severity of these transgressions?" Marcus forced himself to meet Tavern's hostile gaze. "I understand that your sister was suffering, and I had the skills to help her. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty." "Your arrogance is astounding," Tavern snarled, taking a step forward. "You humans think you can..." "Tavern." Yenara's voice cracked like a whip. "That is enough." The young male fell silent, though his tail continued to lash. Yenara descended from the platform, moving with liquid grace until she stood directly before Marcus. This close, he could see the fine details of her features, the subtle silver threading in her fur at her temples, the intelligence and pain that lingered in those remarkable green eyes, the way her whiskers trembled slightly with some emotion he couldn't name. She was barely an inch shorter than him, her head tilting as she studied his face. Marcus caught her scent something like jasmine and rain, completely intoxicating. "My daughter," Yenara said softly, her eyes never leaving his, "has not been able to navigate independently for 3 months. Our finest physicians said nothing could be done, that she would require assistance for the rest of her life. In 1 week, you gave her back her freedom." "The technology isn't perfect," Marcus said quickly. "It needs refinements, adjustments as she grows. You were planning to continue helping her," Yenara finished. "Without asking for payment, without seeking recognition. Why?" Marcus glanced over at Nisra, who was watching them with barely contained excitement. "Because she deserved better than being treated like she was broken. Because I know what it's like when people look at you with pity instead of seeing who you actually are." Something flickered across Yenara's face, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Her hand rose slowly, and Marcus held his breath as her fingers tipped with retracted claws touched his cheek gently. "You limp," she observed quietly, "and your hands tremble." Marcus stiffened. "Old injury. Reactor accident. It doesn't affect my work. I did not say it did." Her hand dropped, but she didn't step back. "I am merely noting that perhaps you understand my daughter's situation better than most." "Mother," Tavern said, his voice strained, "surely we are not considering. We are considering what is best for your sister," Yenara cut him off. She turned to address Marcus directly. "House Meridian does not take debts lightly. You have given my daughter an immeasurable gift, and our honor demands acknowledgement." "That's really not necessary," Marcus started. "It is necessary to us," Yenara interrupted firmly. "Therefore, I propose an arrangement. You will continue to work on Nisra's device, making improvements and adjustments as needed. In return, House Meridian will provide you with whatever resources and components you require, as well as compensation for your time. I don't need payment for helping Nisra." Marcus protested. "Then consider it payment for tolerating my son's hostility and my culture's formal proceedings," Yenara said, and there was the ghost of a smile on her feline features. "Additionally, you will dine with us this evening. I wish to understand more about this human who has helped my family. It wasn't a request." "Mother, this is highly irregular," Tavern objected. "Inviting a human to dine with us is my decision to make," Yenara said coolly. "Or have you forgotten who leads this house?" Tavern fell silent, though his expression remained thunderous. Nisra, meanwhile, had managed to slip past her brother and was now standing beside Marcus, her small hand finding his. "Say yes," she whispered urgently. "Please?" Mother never smiles anymore, but she almost smiled just now. Marcus looked down at the child, then up at Yenara, who was watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read. Against his better judgment, against every instinct that said getting involved with Vulcan. Nobility was a terrible idea. He nodded. "I'd be honored." He sighed. "Excellent." Yenara's whiskers twitched. Forward in what he'd learned was a pleased expression. "Tavin will show you to the guest quarters, where you may refresh yourself. Dinner will be served at sunset cycle." As the soldiers escorted Marcus out following Tavern's stiff-backed lead, he glanced back once. Yenara stood in a shaft of light from the high windows, her golden fur glowing, watching him leave with those startling green eyes. Something had shifted in that room. Marcus could feel it like a change in air pressure before a storm. He just wasn't sure if he should run from it or run toward it.